The conversation pauses in the middle of a small meeting room. Someone finishes a sentence, and for a moment, no one speaks. It's not long, maybe 2 seconds. But in that gap, something shifts. Eyes move slightly. One person glances down at their notes. Another adjusts their posture, as if preparing to say something, then doesn't. The silence isn't empty. It feels filled with expectation. And almost automatically, someone breaks it. Anyway, in everyday conversations, silence rarely stays neutral for long. It often becomes something that needs to be managed. Not because silence itself carries meaning, but because people tend to treat it as if it does. When a response doesn't come immediately, the absence of sound starts to invite interpretation. Was that unclear? Did it sound wrong? Is someone waiting for me to continue? The longer the gap lasts, the more likely it is that someone assigns it a direction. And once that process starts, the silence is no longer just a pause. It becomes a space where people begin adjusting their behavior. In many conversations, there's an unspoken rhythm. One person finishes speaking, another responds. Even brief pauses are often followed by continuation. This rhythm isn't formally taught, but it becomes familiar through repeated interactions. Because of that, when the rhythm breaks, when a response doesn't arrive on time, it can feel like something has gone slightly off track. Not necessarily wrong, just unresolved. So instead of waiting, people often step in early. They add clarification, they soften what they just said, or they introduce a new topic altogether. The goal isn't always to improve the conversation. Sometimes it's simply to restore movement. This tendency becomes more visible in situations where the outcome feels uncertain. For example, during a job interview, a candidate answers a question. The interviewer nods, but doesn't respond immediately. There's a pause. In that moment, the candidate doesn't know whether the answer was sufficient, unclear, or incomplete. So they continue speaking. They add examples. They rephrase their point. They try to close a gap that might not have needed closing. The silence acts less like a break, and more like an open space that invites repair. In group conversations, something slightly different happens. When several people are present, silence can feel like shared responsibility. If no one speaks, it's unclear who is expected to move next. So individuals begin scanning the group. Who's going to take the next turn? If no one signals intent, someone eventually steps in, not always because they have something specific to say, but because the silence itself starts to feel unstable. In this way, speaking becomes a way to stabilize the situation, not just to communicate information. Over time, people learn shortcuts around this. They begin to anticipate silence and preempt it. Instead of pausing, they fill space early. They extend sentences slightly longer than needed. They add small phrases, I guess, kind of, that keep the flow continuous. These additions don't always carry new meaning, but they serve a different function. They reduce the chance that a gap will form. And by doing that, they reduce the chance that the conversation will shift into uncertainty. In some contexts, silence becomes even more noticeable. For example, in one-on-one conversations between people who don't know each other well, without shared patterns or familiarity, it's harder to predict how long a pause is acceptable. So shorter silences can feel longer than they are. A brief pause might be interpreted as hesitation, disinterest, or uncertainty, not because it actually is, but because there's no established reference point. In these situations, people often rely more heavily on continuous speech to maintain a sense of stability. But in other contexts, the same silence behaves differently. Between people who interact regularly, pauses can stretch longer without triggering the same response. A conversation can stop for a few seconds. Neither person rushes to fill it. The silence doesn't demand interpretation in the same way. It remains a pause. Something that exists, but doesn't need to be resolved immediately. What changes here isn't the silence itself. It's the expectations around it. Across these situations, a pattern begins to emerge. Silence is rarely experienced as just the absence of sound. It often becomes a signal that people try to interpret, manage, or avoid. Not because silence is inherently uncomfortable, but because it interrupts the flow that people have learned to rely on. And when that flow breaks, even briefly, people begin adjusting, sometimes subtly, sometimes immediately. They speak a little sooner. They extend a little longer. They react a little faster. Not always to say more, but to reduce the uncertainty that the silence introduces. And yet, if the same silence appears again, in a different setting with different expectations, different familiarity, or a different rhythm, it may pass without notice, remaining exactly what it was at the beginning. A pause, before anything else is decided.